primary motive. Obviously, there have been a lot of other, I would say, corollaries that have developed as a result of Spark, impact on the whole field of cell and molecular therapy, certainly the biotech community in Philadelphia, but this was really the primary motive. So if you look at the life cycle of academic medicine, what's very clear right now is, we start at the top, clinical margins, the money generated from patient care has become a very important source supporting the academic mission. So that institutions that have generally had very strong clinical programs have been able to plow that money back into research. Certainly since the mid-2000s, the clinical delivery system has been under a lot of stress. We've talked about over many years moving to value-based care. If you look at the campaign even today, people are talking about how are they going to rein in the cost of health care. That all puts especially academic institutions at risk for the loss of the clinical income. The other thing that's very important to note is that there are, in a place like Jefferson or at a place like CHOP, at a place like Penn, it's actually a very small number of patients that generate the margins that drive academic institutions. It's less than about 10% of the patient where most of the margin is made. And you can see that on the chart here. It tends to be those patients that are within very specialized quaternary type programs, transplant, cancer, very complex cardiovascular disease. The vast majority of patients that we care for, the net income generated is actually very small. So academic institutions, for their financial stability, are generally limited to a very small number of patients. So, excuse me. In 2014, you can just get that for me. In 2014, this became pretty well recognized. And you can see here, this is a quote from Bruce Albert, Mark Kirshner, Shirley Tigman, who was the president of Princeton at that time, Harold Varmus, a Nobel Prize winner. The long-held but erroneous assumption of never-ending rapid growth in biomedical sciences has created an unsustainable, hyper-competitive system that is discouraging even the most outstanding prospective students from entering our profession and making it difficult for seasoned investigators to produce their best work. This is a recipe for long-term decline, and the problems cannot be solved by simplistic approaches. Instead, it is time to confront the dangers at hand and rethink some of the fundamental features of the U.S. biomedical research system. So that was very telling from leaders of the biomedical research community. And I think those of you who have been in academic research and have been dependent upon NIH research support know the trials and tribulations of that system. Certainly at most major universities, tenure decisions are made on the basis of actual R01 grants, things like that. So the degree of funding at the governmental level has a major impact on everything that we do. This shows you the trends in biomedical research over the last 20, 25 years. You can see, except for the spike in 2008 related to the Recovery Act, that when President Obama became president, funding has been relatively flat, which with inflation means that there's been a very significant decrease, going back to the notion that academic institutions have to support their own research at an ever-increasing amount. So this is really what people try to look at. If you look at the top of the pyramid, everybody's looking for federal funding and commercialization. They leverage their internal sources, places like Jefferson, places like CHOP, like Penn, can leverage philanthropy to support research, but that alone really cannot make the difference. So, everything must change so everything can stay the same. And that's really the notion here. Really have to change the way that we think about funding for academic research so that we can maintain academic research. So this is a quote from a historical novel called The Leopard, a very famous book about the formation of the state of Italy from the city-states. It was a movie in 1963 that actually won the Best Picture Award in Cannes. Three very famous actors and actresses of that time, Alain Delon, Claudia Cardinale, and Burt Lancaster. So everything must change so everything can stay the same. So, what were our goals based on that? So, after 2008, I was in my 8th year as the CEO of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and I was actively looking for new ways to support research, but was very concerned about, would there be long-term maintenance of clinical margins that would support research? So we actively started a process, consciously started a process to develop our first for-profit enterprise involving research. And so, as I mentioned, it was to diversify future revenue sources for CHOP, establish a new model for commercializing CHOP research and partnering with industry and investors, demonstrating that CHOP can rapidly incubate an idea and aggregate technology from inside and outside the hospital to launch a company, creating a model for and a culture of scientific entrepreneurship, particularly among physician scientists, and that demonstrating that financing a new venture based on CHOP technology creates leverage, allowing the hospital to keep a larger share of the value. So traditionally, when a hospital, when an academic institution wants to commercialize some technology, some intellectual property, they will license it out. Typically, there's a royalty stream. The return to the institution tends to be penny on the dollar. So this was an attempt to really change the paradigm of what the value of commercializing an asset would be for the institution. So we went through a very formal process. I actually brought in a former mentee of mine from Wharton, a gentleman named Jeff Marazzo, who went on to become the CEO of Spark. And I gave him 6 months to basically walk the halls of CHOP and to meet with every investigator in the institution. And then he came back to me with 12 ideas that he thought could be prioritized for for-profit ventures. We went through detailed business analysis of each of these and developed a business plan for one, which was the CHOP Center for Molecular and Cellular Therapeutics. And this became the foundation for Spark, which was the first gene therapy company. So in late 2012, I convinced the CHOP Board of Trustees to allocate $50 million from their endowment to support the setup of this new startup gene therapy company that became known as Spark. So at the time of Spark formations, gene therapy assets were significantly undervalued. You may recall in 1999, there was a gene therapy trial being conducted at the University of Pennsylvania by a leading gene therapy investigator, Jim Wilson. And he had devised an AAV-mediated gene therapy for an inherited metabolic disease. One of the patients, Jesse Gelsinger, who received the therapy a few days after the infusion, became very, very sick. basically went into full-scale failure of all his organs, probably had a massive cytokine release reaction, and died. Obviously, many things happened as a result of that, but most notably is that basically gene therapy died as a viable therapeutic option. The investors completely died out. Any company involved in developing vectors, the constructs for gene therapies basically went under. So this was a very difficult time to actually start the company, but it was also a good time because it was a very contrarian approach to what everybody was thinking. The other part of this was that if we were going to start the company, we really needed the commitment of both our scientific leaders as well as business people that we were going to recruit in. The scientific founder of Spark Therapeutics is Dr. Catherine High, who at the time was a Howard Hughes investigator, one of the early clinical investigators funded by the Howard Hughes Foundation. And I think one of the most remarkable parts that I've actually gotten a lot of grief about over the years is I actually convinced her to give up her Howard Hughes professorship and join the company. That was almost unheard of. But in talking with her, it became very clear that her primary motivation in life, professionally, was to see gene therapy become a viable therapy for disease. And she recognized over a series of discussions that we had, the only way that that was going to happen is that she had to commit full-time to this new venture. And that's what ultimately convinced her to drop this Howard Hughes investigatorship, which I said, is essentially unheard of, to really start the company. Now, going back to that notion that it becomes extremely difficult and risky for academic institutions to support this type of research, this shows you the support for this gene therapy program prior to the formation of Spark by the hospital alone. And you can see that between 2005 and 2013, when we started to get outside investors, was very significant funding commitments, well over $50 million. And I think that becomes the issue that you have to face. Many of the programs that we all deal with now are extremely expensive to run. There's no way to support them on NIH funding, and in this case on both NIH funding and support from the Howard Hughes Foundation. Now, that money, in effect, had created a small biotechnology company within CHOP. Wasn't recognized as such, but it had its own manufacturing facilities, and I'll give you some of the details. It had regulatory capabilities, it had clinical trial facilities, and it actually had shepherded the first gene therapy through to a phase 3 trial, which is, again, almost unheard of. So there was remarkable capabilities here, and there was a lot there that we could use to start the company. So you can see that when we started the company, we had already had 2 active INDs, 3 pre-INDs. We were sponsor and collaborator in research in AAV-mediated ophthalmic and CNS gene therapy, had first U.S. trials of gene therapy in skeletal muscles and others. We were also the sole NIH contract for AAV GMP manufacturing. So this was really, everything was there that was needed to really form a company. Now, when you look at the original assets of Spark, most of the technology came out of CHOP and was licensed from CHOP, but we also had to gain licenses from the University of Pennsylvania and the University of Iowa. And even though I come from the academic institutions, dealing with academic technology transfer offices can be quite difficult. I'm not looking at anybody in particular. And quite time consuming. So this was quite a feat to rapidly gain licenses from 3 academic institutions to really form the basis of the company. And it gave us from the beginning complete freedom to operate, which is really critical in terms of valuation of a biotech company. So you can see there was a lot of press around this. First of all, a not-for-profit hospital putting up $50 million was essentially unheard of anywhere. So, Fierce Biotech, Philadelphia Inquirer, the Pink Sheet, the $50 million commitment by the not-profit Children's Hospital of Philadelphia to launch Spark Therapeutics signifies a continuing renewal of confidence in the field of gene therapy as the hospital spins out a for-profit company for the first time. MIT Technology Reviews, Spark has a chance to be the first gene therapy company to see FDA approval. So, at the time of formation, and this goes back again to the work that had been done within CHOP, these were the major assets. So we had a gene therapy for RPE65 blindness. That's actually the first product that was commercialized. So you can see at formation that was in phase 3. We had a gene therapy in the preclinical farm tox status for choroideremia. We had a phase 2 study for hemophilia B. We had preclinical for hemophilia A at that time. And then we had 3 assets that were actually licensed from the University of Iowa and the CNS. Huntington's disease, Batten's, which is infantile neurodegenerative disease, and actually some work in Alzheimer's. So again, this was a significant set of assets. In the work that I do, you can now see company formations based on one asset and with very little clinical work. And as I think about 2012 compared to where we are today, companies are now starting, with massive valuations, Series A financings, $50, $80 million. It's quite remarkable where biotech has come compared to where we were when we started Spark back in 2013. So we looked at a number of different ways to finance the company, and they're listed here. But I just call your attention to the first to the course that we actually took, which is outlined here in red. So the CHOP investment actually turned out in total, I'll go through this, to be $32.2 million, although they had authorized $50 million. And that we felt gave CHOP the best valuation, the best cash balance to ensure that we could continue working on the company. And you can see we considered private equity. We considered just giving away this initial asset to a company. We were actually approached by a number of the large biopharmas. But so we elected that CHOP would initially fund the company. So the Series A that CHOP provided was $10 million of that initial 50. The other thing that was critically important from the beginning, because of this contrarian view, gene therapy was basically out, was creating an independent board of directors that could give the company credibility, both within the academic institutions, but also on the street. So the board asked me to chair the company, which I did and continued throughout its existence. One of the first people I was able to recruit is a gentleman named Elliot Siegel, who's a partner at NEA, which is a large venture firm. But he was the former executive vice president and chief scientific officer and president of R&D at Bristol Myers Squibb. Was able to recruit Vincent Milano, who you may know, who was president and CEO of Biopharma, which is a very successful Philadelphia company that went on to sell to Shire, and then two individuals from our Series B lead. So this is a Forbes article on gene therapy in March 2014. I just read it to you. Elliot Siegel earned a reputation at Bristol Myers Squibb as one of the drug industry's best research chief. His bets on risky technology like cancer immunotherapy and new types of diabetes drugs helped Bristol turn from a laggard into a growth stock. But there was one technology he wouldn't touch, gene therapy, which tries to use engineered viruses to defeat disease at the DNA level. I was burned on it myself 20 years ago, he says. When they told me gene therapy was back, I couldn't believe it. So what's Siegel doing now? As a venture partner at New Enterprise Associates, he just took his first board seat at a gene therapy company, Philadelphia Spark Therapeutics, which raised $50 million last October from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and hopes to launch a treatment for a genetic form of blindness in little as 2 years. So the only thing I can say is I'm a good salesman, and having somebody like Elliot on the board was critical really in establishing the credibility for this brand new contrarian type company. Now, the first drug that Spark developed was a gene therapy for an inherited form of blindness, a deficiency in the RPE65 gene. It's one of the multiple genes that is part of the retinitis pigmentosa family. This was, I have to say, one of the reasons that we were successful in bringing investors back to the field. What I'm going to show you is one of the first patients who received the gene therapy as part of the phase 3 trial. This is a young man, 8 years of age, who you will see was totally blind beforehand.
I'll tell you if you're going the wrong direction.
So there's some audio in back of it, but basically this is a maze that we developed to test visual acuity.
Turn right.
This is hard.
So he just said this is hard.
This is hard.
We can't make it too easy for you.
Just do the best you can. Anything.
Just do the best you can.
Stop sign. Again. Again, the stop sign. This is being really hard.
So he's in a course that has a series of arrows that takes him around to make acute right turns, and then eventually to get to that door and open it and close it. He's completely unable to do this task. In the background is Dr. Jean Bennett, who's one of the ophthalmologists who's responsible for this gene therapy.
I'll tell you if you're going the wrong direction. I'll tell you if you're going the wrong direction.
Okay, so now this is the same child after receiving a bilateral injection of the gene therapy for this RPE65 deficiency. If I can get it to work.
All right.
Okay.
And you can start whenever you're ready.
Going over a barrier.
can start when.
So this was Jim Wilson's quote afterwards. It is biblical, the blind man can now see. And it was these set of videos that got the investor community behind this company. As you can imagine, there's never been anything quite like this. Now, on a note of levity to honor Philadelphia, you could also do, as Eddie Murphy said in Trading Places, I can see I have legs. For those of you who remember that movie from the 80s. So this is the funding history of Spark from the Series A. And you can see the Series A financing of $10 million by CHOP in 2013. So 50 was allocated. The board allowed $10 million to be used initially. A few months later, because of continued results with our phase 3 trial, we were able to get CHOP to put in another $22.5 million, and then raise $50 million from an external syndicate. Those were the investor syndicate. Sophie Nova Ventures were the lead, Baker Brothers, Brookside, Deerfield, T. Rowe Price. The only reason I mention them is that they are really considered to be the A-plus venture investors. And that's very important, again, in terms of credibility, and then for what came afterwards in terms of being able to get the company to become public. So you can see that post that Series B, the company now had a valuation of $150 million, with CHOP having a fully diluted stake of 47%, and we had funding at that time for about a year and a half. Actually, because the market was so good, a few months later, we elected to take the company through an IPO. And that was an IPO of 7 million shares, offered at $23 a share on January 30th, 2015. The most notable thing about that day is that the other company that went public that day is Shake Shack. Trading started at $45.10 and closed at $50 a share, yielding a market cap of $1.15 billion, of which CHOP owned 37%. So you can see CHOP made an investment of $32.2 million, and just at the time of the IPO had an investment value of over $300 million. So, as I'd mentioned, Spark was really on its way. It had multiple assets and for different disease entities. It had Veratogene, which was the therapy for the blindness. That had developed, that had shown tremendous results in phase 3. We had an investigational gene therapy for hemophilia B that also showed great results, and I'll show you that in a minute. And because of that, we were able very early on to develop a licensing agreement with Pfizer, where they supported the entire phase 3 trial, plus gave us royalties. So this was a way to ensure the financial security of the company. And as a result of that, in 2016, the MIT Technology Review rated Spark number 9 out of 50 companies and the top-ranked biopharmaceutical company for that year. So the first therapy, as I mentioned, was in the eye, which turned out to be very fortuitous. First of all, an ultra-rare disease, so the number of patients that one had to prove success in was relatively small. The eye, also importantly, was segregated from the body and was outside the immune system, which, as you'll see, became very important. We're now going to move to a series of conditions that involve systemic administration of viral vectors. And so the potential for side effects, as we saw earlier with the Jim Wilson trial, became more problem. There's also the issue of an immune reaction, so that the sustainability of therapies becomes problematic. And so these were some of the issues that we had to deal with as we were thinking about moving this program into hemophilia. Now, when we did our first trial, which was in hemophilia B, two forms of hemophilia, A and B. A is factor VIII deficiency in the cascade. Hemophilia B is factor IX. The factor IX deficiency is much less common. What this shows you is that after infusion, you can see among these participants, basically bleeding episodes went away completely. It was quite remarkable. It was, really across the board. So you can see no confirmed bleed since the injection of SBK 901, which was the gene therapy, in these 9 participants, and then a 99% reduction in factor use since giving the infusion. Now, if you look at the standard of care for hemophilia, patients take prophylactic factor and also take factor when they have active bleeding. The average cost per patient of either hemophilia A or hemophilia B is about $450,000 to $500,000 per year. Quite expensive, and I think all of you know early on the comorbidities, originally HIV, now even hepatitis C is very common. So the fact that you could basically eradicate the disease and change the standard of care, you can think about over the long term what the potential savings is to the healthcare system. I bring this up because there's a lot of talk about the cost of these drugs, and we'll get into this a little bit. But if you can develop a gene therapy that can truly do this, if you look at the savings over time, even a drug that cost $1 million or $2 million has immense savings for the system. Our insurance system may not be able to deal with that, but the savings of the system can be quite extraordinary. So following that, in 2017 and 2018, the first ever FDA and EMA approval for gene therapy for an inherited disease, Luxturna, was approved. Now, this is a difficult drug to administer. It has to be given in the back of the retina. And so what we elected to do was to limit the administration of the drugs to 10 centers nationally, so that we would have real expertise among retinal surgeons. Wills happens to be one of the sites, CHOP, Mass Eye and Ear. You could imagine Baskin Palmer down in Florida. And so this was very well received by the government and by insurers, that we were trying to ensure high quality administration of this drug, because it is so difficult. And you can see kind of a cartoon that shows you what you have to do. We also had to really develop a very different type of company that was very much patient-centric. This is an ultra-rare disease. We had to develop mechanisms to identify patients appropriately, get them to the centers appropriately, And these are some of the things that we built into our patient identification program. The other thing is, again, we felt this was an extremely expensive therapy. We had to provide guarantees that it would work. So Luxturna, when it came out, the list price was $900,000, $450,000 for each eye. And you can see Spark Therapeutics announces the first of their kind program to improve patient access to Luxturna, a one-time gene therapy program. And so we basically offered outcomes-based rebates so that if sight was not restored immediately and was not there at 3 months, the insurance company would be rebated and then at a later time. And you can see that we were able to generate contracts with Harvard Pilgrim initially, then with all the major payers. And so that our approach was to really share risk with the payers and to take a value-based approach to this therapy, which again was really setting a very new standard. Now the other sort of challenges that we had to face was really now developing a commercial size and grade, commercial scale for manufacturing. One of the advantages of working in the eye was very small volumes of vector were needed. Moving to hemophilia, which is systemic, and some of the other things required much more volume. So we had to go through a whole scale-up and tech transfer from moving from one form of gene therapy manufacturing to another. Very difficult process, requires a lot of FDA input and review, but it was something that we felt was very necessary to really propel the company to the next level. And this becomes critically important when we were considering the sale to Roche Therapeutics. They paid a lot of money for the company. One of the reasons that they valued the company so highly was the manufacturing expertise, which at the time and still is considered to be much better than what's generally available on the market. So this was a big risk to do, but something that paid off in the end. Now, when you go into a biotech company, investors can make choices on the results of 1 or 2 patients. And I can't say here that the ride with Spark was only up. There were many ups and downs. And one of them was a very interesting set of circumstances. We reported data at a national meeting, the American Society of Hematology, where basically after giving gene therapy for hemophilia A, we completely wiped out any bleeding episodes afterwards. But the factor levels that we generated were not at the level that the investors were expecting. So they were expecting us to generate levels of 20% of normal on a consistent basis. We were only generating levels, because of some variability in the 10% range, but no patient had any bleeds. But our stock was killed. Dropped 50% over the course of a few days. So that shows you the type of thing that you have to deal with in this community. And I work with a lot of biotech companies right now, and as I said, the results of 1 or 2 patients can drive investors or the ability to raise money. So last year, about this time, I was at the JP Morgan conference, which is a big biotech investor conference, and our board met in secret away from the meeting at the law offices of one of our attorneys to consider an unsolicited offer from Roche Therapeutics. A month or so before that, our CEO was contacted by the CEO of Roche. They offered a figure of $70 a share for Spark Therapeutics. We were trading at about $50 a share at that time. We rejected the offer at that time, but we told them that we would consider higher. They refused. And we then brought in a group of bankers, and we decided to do an auction, so that we invited 4 different companies to bid for the assets of Spark. 2 eventually did, Roche and Pfizer. And as a result of that auction, you can see we were able to sell the company for $114.50 per share, so 122% premium on Spark's closing price, representing a total equity value of $4.8 billion. So go back to what CHOP's stake was, and we'll talk about what they sort of earned from this. So the other thing about Roche, for those of you who know the company, typically when they make these acquisitions, they allow the companies to continue to function semi-independently. Roche has also made the commitment, and this is important for the city of Philadelphia, that they will invest $1 billion in new manufacturing facilities for Spark Therapeutics. Spark Therapeutics offices are up at the old Bolton building, the first building out of Schuylkill Yards, and there will be additional development there. So CHOP realizes an $800 million return on a $32.5 million total investment in Spark. Now, nothing is easy. This deal was announced February of last year and was held up until December 23rd by the FTC and the equivalent organization in the UK because of concerns about antitrust. There was also thought that that Roche might be buying Spark to suppress the gene therapy trials because Roche has another product for hemophilia called Hemlibra, which is a bridging antibody. But finally, after multiple lawyers, a lot of money, we were able to get the sale signed, sealed, and delivered, you can see, on December 17, 2019. So if you go back to the first slide about what were the goals of this deal, diversifying future revenue sources for CHOP, yes. Establishing a new model for commercializing research, yes. Demonstrating that CHOP can rapidly incubate an idea and aggregate technology. Hopefully, I'm no longer the CEO, but hopefully creating a model and culture for scientific entrepreneurship. And then demonstrating that financing a new venture based on CHOP technology creates leverage, allowing the hospital to keep a larger share of the value. Definitely yes. So for any of you who are interested, can help you get them. Harvard Business School thought this was such an unusual case. There's actually a case study on the whole development of this. There's a lot more detail there, obviously, so that's available if anybody is interested. And then to finalize, this is for Donna. Sometimes the light's all shining on me, other times I can barely see. Lately it occurs to me what a long, strange trip it's been. And this has truly been a long, strange trip. So thank you very much.
Did I ever show you the book that I have of his?
Oh, no.
Yeah, so he's written a number of poetic books, and I went to a concert a million years ago, and he autographed it. So, yeah, Robert Hunter is the preeminent lyricist for the Grateful Dead and a poet in his own right. He did Rilke, too, which was kind of interesting. So I'm sure that we have a lot of questions for, I knew Heather would have. Point of personal privilege, Heather is my colleague.
That was great. And having lived through all this, it was exciting to watch from the Philly side, the gene therapy enthusiast side. I'm interested in CHOP not diversifying the risk and not spreading out the investment across multiple technologies, and I'm assuming that was a separate discussion as well. Or did you, and we're just not talking about those? Just making that one singular investment. I realize you brought on a consortium of excellent consultants to select the technology, but was there a talk about splitting it into 2 parcels of 15 or, 3, et cetera?
That's a very, very good question. So the concept that I wanted to develop was something like this possible? And let's do it with one first, right? So we spent, that 6 or 9 months really determining what had the most likelihood of success, and then went with that. CHOP has seeded other companies, but really as part of a different program. But the notion of taking a big chunk of money, $50 million, we decided to do with one at that time, and then see if we could really prove this out. It's something actually that CHOP hasn't done again since I left, which was in 2015, because I don't think they have the same. The current CEO just has a completely different kind of focus. But traditionally you would try to spread risk, but this was really a test to see that we could start up a company, take it completely through the IPO, and then to whatever the exit was going to be.
You did it all on the right one?
Yeah. And it worked.
Yeah.
As they say, it's better to be lucky than good, right?
I had a sort of a scientific question, which was, you talked about the immune privilege sites, and there's always was this concern about what you would be able to do or not do with gene therapy type technologies. So are we at a place now where this approach is broadly applicable to all kinds of disease areas, like even diabetes? So can you talk about what's possible now?
So, AAV, which is the gene therapy transfer mechanism for non-hematopoietic stem cells. For hematopoietic stem cells, you use lentivirus. Is a very ubiquitous virus, so that there is a higher rate or a higher potential for immune function. So in our work with hemophilia A, Biomarin that has a product in hemophilia A, all have seen issues with persistence of the therapy, presumably due to the immune response. Now, there is a lot of work being done now to generate hybrid AAVs, both that have specific tropism for organisms, but also because they're not ubiquitous, in our environment, wouldn't necessarily generate an immune response. I think that's one way. There are also other approaches that people are using in terms of how you would modulate the immune response. So in our patients, the standard approach to modulating the immune response is to give steroids. Steroids will, give steroids, the factor levels will go up, you take it away, it'll go down. So there's definitely a lot of work. So I'd say there's been some progress. There's no universal AAV vector yet. The other thing is now we're seeing a lot of work being done with non-viral vectors, lipid nanoparticles, other type of nanoparticles. So I think you'll see more work in the AAV space, but as well as these other type of approaches for vectors.
So this is a marvelous story. It's difficult for us at Jefferson to contemplate our administration ever trying that. So what I wonder at CHOP is, what was the most difficult argument you faced? I won't ask you to name names, but what was the argument against, and how did you overcome that key barrier?
So, when we started this, I'll be frank with you, I had been CEO for 12 years. We had a great track record of success, #1 hospital in the country, financially had done really, really well for many, many years. And I think I made a compelling case to the board that, they wanted to support research at a higher level. And for us, we were taking $300 million of clinical income to support the research enterprise, in addition to what we were getting from the NIH and other areas. And I felt that was unsustainable. And basically, what I did was convince the board. Now, I had a number of board members at that time, that came from the investor and entrepreneurial community so that they could really see the rationale here. And I think, it was my long-term tenure, my credibility and delivering on other things that we did, and the financial security within the institution. I mean, I know Jefferson a little bit. I think, Dr. Klasko has talked about, these type of initiatives. I think you have to find the right one, and obviously you have to get the board behind you, right? Because $50 million, I mean, CHOP had, an endowment of $3 billion at that time, so it wasn't going to end the institution, but it's not chump change. So those are the type of things you have to think about. And as I said, CHOP has not done another one since I've left because the current CEO doesn't believe or doesn't have the same sort of, I would say entrepreneurial intent that I had. So I think it's very personal, and all the dynamics were right.
So, Steve, while you're rolling the tapes in your head of making that persuasive case to the board, you mentioned that you had people who had investment backgrounds, and so they kind of got where you were going with this. And you had the political capital necessary to persuade the board because of your very substantial rock star track record. How did you manage talented investor-style board members that might wanted to have co-invested?
Incredibly great question. The answer was absolutely not. So that immediately we set up institutional conflict of interest standards and that no board member could invest. It was actually, even as the board chair, everything that I did for Spark, I could not benefit personally, had to go back to the hospital. So we were very strict about that, which is very important. If you, most recently, all the controversy at Memorial Sloan Kettering, other institutions where board members have invested. So absolutely no board member could invest. And some people sort of, I'd like to, but eventually it was not an issue.
And presumably when all those other controversies bubbled up, they remembered those conversations.
Yes.
Hopefully. Anybody else? We have time for maybe one more question. If there's nobody else here, well, you're always welcome to ask.
From the historic point of view, the UCLA effort in Mediterranean anemia in the 80s that crashed and burned with the Martin Klein affair, is that in any way historically a predecessor to this work?
So, there was certainly that work was one of the predecessors, but there were a whole series of, of studies that were beginning to show the viability of the gene therapy approach. So there was UCLA that had done a lot of work. There was University College London, which had a number of preliminary studies. So, it was a whole series of events. There was an investigator who is now at Stanford, Maria Graziano, who was in Italy at the time at the, I can't remember, it's a very famous hospital in hematological diseases. They had a gene therapy program that had started. They had actually provided some of the initial IP for GlaxoSmithKline's rare disease program. So there were a number of different places, but UCLA was certainly one of the ones that was very important.
Do you think Klein's work, even though Congressman Ward didn't like it, do you think Klein's work is worthy of note?
Worthy of note? Yes. I think it's critically important. I think all these type of studies really form the basis, and gave investigators like Dr. Hai, material that they could start to look at. Certainly there's been very fundamental changes since that time, but these works are all critical, important to form kind of the basis of this technology. Yes. You're welcome, sir.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Altschuler for being with us.
Thank you. Sure.